Most people think that if they walk away from a pre-sale condo, the worst that they're going to lose is their deposit. But that is not how it works in Canada, especially here in British Columbia. I just got off the phone with a buyer who walked away from their pre-sale in Vancouver, assuming that their loss was going to be capped at their deposit amount of $150,000. But now they're facing a lawsuit for roughly another $70,000 plus legal expenses. You see, here in BC, developers, they have the legal right to pursue damages beyond the deposit when the buyer defaults. And so they thought that by walking away, it meant that it was all done. But that belief that the deposit was their maximum risk, well, that may be one of the most expensive misconceptions in real estate today. So listen, if you've signed a pre-sale contract or if you're near to closing, you need to understand what's really going on, because here's what most people are missing. The market, it has shifted. Condo prices in Greater Vancouver, they have continued to decline. And interest rates are much higher than when many of these contracts were signed. The Bank of Canada, they raised the key rate multiple times from near 0.25% in early 2022 to about 5% by mid-2023. And that shift created a real problem. A lot of buyers who easily qualified a couple of years ago, they're now finding out that they can't qualify today under the new lending rules. And when these deals fall apart, developers aren't just letting it slide, they're taking action. In BC, when a buyer fails to complete, the developer, they not only keep the deposit, they also have the legal right to pursue additional damages if the resale price ends up lower than the original contract price. Now, the truth is, the law doesn't care if your mortgage payment has doubled or, if the unit that you bought is now worth less than what your contract price was. And if you default, the developer can, and they often will, seek legal damages beyond the deposit. And I'm not just talking about investors who are getting caught in this. I'm talking about young families, downsizers, even first-time buyers who genuinely plan to complete. Everyone is getting blindsided by today's market conditions. And so in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how these lawsuits are playing out, what your legal exposure might look like, and what you can do right now if you're under contract for a pre-sale. We're going to cover a few things that you will not hear in the sales center or frankly from most agents, because the biggest financial risks, they show up after you sign that contract. Now, to really understand how we ended up here, we need to rewind just a little bit and go back in time. So from around 2017 to 2021, buying a pre-sale condo in Vancouver, it felt like a no-brainer, right? I mean, the market was hot, interest rates were low, and buyers were lining up to get into towers before the shovel even hit the ground. You didn't necessarily need a mortgage right away. It was just the deposit. The assumption was simple. By the time the tower was built, it's going to be worth more. That was the bet. And for a while, it paid off. People weren't running the numbers on today's affordability. They were banking on appreciation. And builders, they knew it. Projects, they kept launching, contracts were signed, and it all became part of Vancouver's real estate playbook. But then the lending landscape, it changed, and rapidly. Between March 2022 and July 2023, the Bank of Canada, they raised the key interest rate 10 times, sending borrowing costs much higher. Now, at that time, condo prices in parts of Metro Vancouver, they also began to ease. So imagine you bought a pre-sale condo in 2021. You paid $760,000. You put down a 20% deposit. That's $152,000. But now, similar units, they're selling for closer to $690,000. And if you walk away, you're going to lose your deposit. But it gets worse. The developer, they can resell that unit at a lower price, and then they can sue you for the difference. Now, a lot of people assume that if they were approved once, they're going to get approved again when it's time to close. But that is not always the case. You see, if the condo doesn't appraise for the full purchase price, the lender usually won't cover it. They're only going to finance up to the appraised value. And that gap is going to be on you, the buyer. The buyer is responsible for covering the shortfall. And if you don't have those extra funds, you might not be able to close at all. And that's when the legal and financial risks, they really start to pile up. Also, one fallback a lot of buyers think they have is assigning the contract, just finding someone else to take it over. And in theory, that sounds like it might be a solid plan, but in reality, it's not always that simple. You see, many developers, they don't allow assignments at all, or they tack on high fees or strict conditions that make it very difficult to assign. So even if you're allowed to assign, you still have to find a buyer who's willing to take over that contract. And let's face it, we are in a soft market. So that can be a real uphill battle, especially if prices have dropped. So if you're counting on an assignment as your plan B, please make sure that you understand the fine print and also have a backup for your backup. I've spoken with buyers who confidently thought they would qualify at completion. But by the time that unit was ready, interest rates had nearly doubled. Their debt to service ratios, they no longer worked. Pre-approvals, they expired, and the numbers, they didn't pencil out anymore. One couple, they were downsizing from a home, hoping to pocket the equity and live mortgage-free in a smaller condo, right? But their old home, it sold for less than what they expected. Their closing costs, they didn't line up, and they wound up unable to complete on that condo. Now, that's not just financially stressful, that's really emotionally brutal. Another pair of buyers, first-time buyers, they had saved for years and this was going to be their opportunity, right? But the appraisal, it came back too low and the lender, they would not cover the gap. And of course, they had no fallback plan. Guys, before you put a comment below saying, these greedy investors like so many people are doing lately in the comments, please remember a lot of these people in these contracts are just regular folks, right? They're first-time buyers, they're young families, they're downsizers just trying to simplify. They're not speculators. And that impact, it goes far beyond just any one buyer. So listen, you've already heard me break down all of the risks, but what most people don't realize is how these risks, they ripple forward. They don't just affect the person who defaults. They can start to drag down an entire building. You see, when multiple buyers walk away from a pre-sale contract, developers, they end up reselling those units at a discount. Those discounted relistings from the developer, they can drag down your appraisal value and make it much harder for you to justify your asking price. And this is exactly why pricing strategy matters so much right now. So if you're trying to resell your own unit in the same building, even if you've added upgrades, those discounted relistings from the developer, they can drag down your appraised value and make it much harder for you to justify your asking price. And this is exactly why pricing strategy, it matters so much right now. So if you are planning to list, you need someone who understands how everything that's happening in the market today can impact your unit's value. And you need to price around all of that, all right? And if you just want to start with a free AI-generated home value estimate, I'm going to put a link in the description box below for you. Now, if you're on the other side of things and you're thinking about buying a pre-sale today, this is your time to slow down, all right? Slow down. Read the fine print. Don't assume that your deposit is your only risk, and ask about the assignment clause, and also be sure that you can assign the contract if your situation does change. Also, you want to make sure that you clearly understand any restrictions and fees that will apply if you do decide to assign. And equally important, don't assume that your financing is locked in. Remember, lenders are only going to fund up to the appraised value at the time of completion, meaning if the market drops and your appraised value comes in lower than your purchase price, you will be responsible for covering the shortfall. So build in that safety buffer right now, okay? Budget for closing costs, GST, potential delays, and also don't skip the legal review, okay? A 1-hour contract review with a real estate lawyer, it could literally save you 6 figures in the long run. So make sure you do that. Also, if you're already signed and you're in that waiting period before completion, don't stay in the dark. Know your numbers and get very clear, get a clear picture on your exposure, because the earlier you start managing your risk, the more options you're going to have, and the less likely you're going to be forced into a tough decision later. Now, if you're planning to list your home, there's one more trap that you need to know about. Now, it's not obvious at first, but once your home hits the market, it can unravel everything very quickly. And most sellers, they don't see it coming until it's too late. And once that momentum, it shifts, well, it's very hard to recover. So go ahead, watch this next video right now, because in it, I'm going to reveal 5 things that you should never do after listing your home for sale. Now, if you have any questions about what we talked about today or about your specific situation, feel free to reach out. There is a link in the description box below. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.